Welcome to It Is What It Is. I'm Corbin,
And I'm Anthony.
and today we're going to be continuing on with this idea of it is what it is and looking more into the philosophy of cause and effect and determinism and free will.
I'm very excited. I like to think of us as the live good place.
Nice, yeah. Yeah. Instead of the afterlife, we're just talking about sports and pop culture.
Right.
So, determinism is a pretty, I think, easy concept to grasp, but most of us, I think, initially want to reject it as, at least as growing up as children, we tend to think of ourselves as agents and in full control of our choices. And we get frustrated when our choices are frustrated, when somebody says no, and we're compelled to do something other than what we want to do. So, this idea of cause and effect kind of being in control of our lives is one that probably a lot of people would resist, at least initially, and maybe even throughout their lives. I think in our day and age, it's becoming a little bit more commonplace. But let's just go into a little bit about what determinism is philosophically and scientifically.
I'm ready.
So, all right. So the idea is that every effect has a cause. If some state of affairs exists, it's because some prior state of affairs got to that place. So whether it's one cause to one effect or a whole series of causes to one effect or a network of effects, all of these things work together to have a linear chain where effect has prior cause, which was an effect, which had a prior cause, which had a prior cause, back to infinity or back to an original cause, depending on your worldview.
Oh, just for clarity, what's like one really basic example that you kind of latch onto?
I like the idea of pointing out necessary and sufficient causes. So, sufficient causes, if the cause exists, then the effect will come into being. And a necessary cause is that if the effect existed, then that cause had to be there because without that cause, that effect would not have come into being. So it's kind of one is a positive, like A is going to cause B, that's the sufficient. And without A, B can't happen. That's the necessary. Some causes are both necessary and sufficient. That's like a really powerful, this existence will get you this second state of affairs. But sometimes you can have like a sufficient cause that has a lot of other factors and causes. And so the effect might be overdetermined. It might have more than one cause, so to say.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was actually just going to ask about that necessary and sufficient thing. So as an example, I'm going to illustrate. I'll use this example of rolling a dice to kind of get at this necessary and sufficient, because I also want to use this example in a future episode as we dive deeper into determinism. So when you roll a dice, right? Like for the game of Sorry or Monopoly or whatever, you roll it, you get double sixes. That double six couldn't have happened without you grabbing the dice and throwing it. That would be the necessary component, right?
Yeah, without the dice, there'd be no die results. Yes.
Right. And I think in this case, it's both necessary and sufficient. And the sufficient part comes when the dice hit the table and bounce and, interact with whatever's on the board. Sometimes there's Monopoly houses, that sort of thing. And those things you think add randomness to the scenario, right? You're just throwing this dice and it lands up whatever, but all these little interactions interact with the dice and that affects what number it's going to land on. I guess a better example is like loaded dice, right? You have like a weight on one side of the die, you roll it, and it gives a higher likelihood that that's going to end up that number because the weight is there. So that provides the sufficiency aspect of it.
I was just going to say that's a good point in that the weight there helps take advantage of the other causal factors and plays into them instead of allowing to chance which ones will have an effect.
So when we think of, cause and effect, I had this epiphany in college. I was taking this human biology course, and it was all about actually like basically microbiology, the science of our DNA. And the epiphany was that we basically have no choice. We have no free will. Everything is predetermined in our head. And I'm using the word predetermined. I know it's very overly simplistic in this case. but it like the life was sucked out of me in this moment. And it's kind of stuck with me ever since. So according to microbiology, there's this idea of the central dogma. This is exactly what I was like, was fundamental to my research. So the central dogma is that our DNA, the four base pairs that make up our DNA, AGTC, form these long strings of information. That DNA gets turned into RNA, which are shorter strings. They're basically the same base pairs. But that RNA is used to make proteins. And the proteins, it's not like, the stuff that makes us strong, that's in milk, but these proteins basically do everything that our body needs to be done. So you think of, producing insulin, proteins do that. Proteins are in our saliva that break down the sugars. Proteins are in our brain that sends neurotransmitters between neurons. So everything, our skin color, our hair color, well, not this hair, all of this stuff is determined by proteins. And so, a very simple view of this is that the things that we say and do are influenced by the proteins that exist in our brain. You think of psychological disorders like anxiety and depression, those are influenced by the chemicals in our brain, which are generated by these proteins. Um, the so the proteins, they affect the things that we say and do. Those proteins are made by the RNA, and the RNA is made by DNA. And so it's pretty fair to say that DNA, which is within us and unchanged from the moment of our birth, is like the thing that affects everything we say and do throughout our lives. And I know that's really simple now, and in future episodes I'll go nuts at this part.
So the knee bone's connected to the shin bone. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. And now you're a microbiologist.
I wonder if you could expound a little bit about how DNA can play this role when you've got, obviously DNA is inherited. And so you've got family units where people have very similar DNA. You've got the offspring has DNA from the parents, and they're siblings. And yet we can see such differences between siblings. So can you talk about how we can understand determinism when we see the DNA still have such variety of outcomes?
Yeah, so I guess this kind of goes back into the dice scenario. So, our parents each have DNA from their parents, right? And when we're conceived, the DNA, single strand of DNA from your father and a single strand of DNA from your mother get recombined to make the DNA that you are. And so all of those combinations of possibilities, it varies from person to person. This is why you and your brother have similarities in appearance, but you also have some dissimilarities, right? Maybe like my brother and I, for instance, have like completely different hairstyle, similar body types, but our eyes are different, and also stuff like he's right-handed and I'm left-handed. And so that's kind of a matter of like, there's this rolling the dice aspect of it. Like things get chopped up and then things get put back together. And it's not guaranteed that things are going to get put back together properly. But here's the deterministic part of it is all of the things that put your body or you put your DNA together are affected by all the things that are in the environment with which all these things get placed back together. So you're talking body temperature, you're talking the right proportion of chemicals. So things like, and this is not 100% accurate, but things like, if your parents are malnourished or, they're doing like smoking and drinking while you're being born, those affect what's going to happen within your body. And so you could say that, their very actions affect how you're going to turn out, when you're born and even later in life.
Yeah, I think it's important too to just say here for a second that we are saying that there are causes, not that we can explain what they are. So science has grown tremendously over the last few centuries and millennia. And we have so many different branches of science, right? You've been focusing specifically on like biochemistry,
right?
But there's physics, there's geology, like there's all these different branches of science, and they have subspecialties, and they all can say and explain a lot. and yet there's still a lot that we don't know. And I think what the determinist thesis would say is, just because we don't know the cause doesn't mean that there isn't one. So ignorance is not an excuse or is not a proof of freedom. It just shows that there's something yet that we have yet to explain. So if we take all the things you're saying about how DNA is affected by prior actions and environments, and how it plays out in the environments as you grow up, then there are a lot of factors. There's so many factors, in fact, that we may not be able to identify all of them. But if we could, if we had an omniscient point of view and could specify everything, then presumably we could give a complete and coherent story of every action that you've ever taken. And that, I think, is what determinism is claiming.
Yeah, I think that specifically nails it. And I'm going to take the resentment ideology in here and just blame my lack of knowledge on all the variables that I don't know yet.
Right, I was determined to be ignorant. I'll set the stage and then let you kind of explain it out. But we have had this debate raging for a long time now about who's the greatest player in the NBA history. And for a while, Jordan was unquestioned as the GOAT. And then LeBron James came along, and there's kind of been this debate for most of his career if he was going to be able to surpass Jordan and whether he has or not. But we wanted to examine how Jordan's greatness was the result of different things in his life that led to him pushing himself to learn different skills and to be determined and have a certain personality that drove him to succeed in the way that he did. And interestingly, that subsequent players saw Mike play. There's the whole "Be Like Mike" campaign, and we all wanted to be like Mike. I tried the reverse Air Jordan and try all the different moves that he did. And you see players in the following generations like Kobe, who did exemplify Jordan's moves and try to learn them and perfect them. And so in a certain way, there's a causal relationship between succeeding in one generation and how the next generation develops and plays.
Yeah, so we've said this before that your upbringing and your environment influences what you will become. And that's a big pillar of education, honestly. And so like when we're talking about Jordan, right? You could even argue that he wouldn't be Jordan if there weren't players like him before. You think of the first person that comes to mind is Dr. J, right? With his aerial acrobatics. And even Jordan's famous, dunk from the free throw line was done before him. So he's not the originator of that idea. And if Dr. J's hadn't been so, phenomenal, Jordan probably wouldn't have even had the platform to try such a spectacular feat. Arguably better. Um, and so let's ignore Jordan's entire history and just look at Jordan in the NBA. And then
Okay.
here's this comparison. I think we'll talk about Kobe, before we get to the LeBron stage, because Kobe had, his generation of play slightly overlapped with Jordan's. He came out in the '96 draft, and Jordan, had just won his first set of second championships, or second set of first championships with the Bulls. And so there's overlap there. So not only did Jordan's style of play prior to this influence Kobe, but then Kobe played with Jordan, so he had a direct way of measuring. And I think the similarity between the two is that they're both known and well regarded as being the most competitive players in the
Hmm.
NBA. And I think when it comes to competition, of all forms, there's a little bit of emulation and there's a little bit of one-upsmanship. And I think that you can't have either of those two things without this deterministic approach.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if our viewers would have considered that emulation is related to a causal relationship. Maybe a lot of us want to think that um, that's one of our personal choices. Like we figure out who we want to idolize, and we get to choose what elements of their life we want to emulate. But if the story that we've been painting with determinism is right, then Kobe had no choice but when encountering situations where he was playing basketball to be influenced by those that were being promoted as the best ever. And because he excelled at it, it gave him an opportunity to continue training and to be provided the opportunities to devote so much time to it. and his personality was shaped by his personal biography, but also by the competitiveness that was the stage in which he was raised. And so we could really try and spell out a detail of how Kobe's emulation of Jordan is a direct result of all these combination of factors, which includes Jordan's time in the NBA. And if Jordan hadn't been there, maybe Kobe wouldn't be the player that he was. And I think it's interesting to talk about how, as an avenue, a direction of exploration occurs, there's expansion and then there's perfection. And then you expand to a new niche and you perfect it. So I think of like Nirvana as maybe the greatest grunge band of all time, but they weren't the first to do grunge. By far, they were near the end of the grunge movement. And you can see the Pixies and some of the other bands that went before them that really experimented and had a great new sound, and it was novel. But then Nirvana like figured out the elements, put them together in a certain way, brought out a pathos that exemplified what grunge was. And then because they kind of perfected it, grunge lived on, and there were Nirvana follow-up acts. But really, then we started seeing expansions into new forms of alternative music because we had seen grunge. And I know that you wanted to talk about pop music, maybe in a similar vein.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, and that's how Taylor Swift became known as the Queen of Grunge, right?
Right, exactly.
But I think, this what you just said is a perfect example, and you see it all the time in pop music, right? It's not a revolutionary form of music because, and I'm not trying to trash the genre, but it's essentially a recycled set of sounds tweaked just enough to sound different and appealing. So, but there's this aspect of familiarity to it that makes you instantly want to attach to it. So like if you're really into niche music, it's not going to resonate well, but it is going to sound familiar. And everybody always complains about how pop is so repetitive. And they're not just talking about a single song being repetitive, but they're also essentially talking about how every song sounds the same. And and so then you fall into this, this trap of like, okay, if we want everybody to like it, we have to make it sound exactly like the last song that everybody liked, and then just add this one new twist to it so that we can claim it as original.
Yeah, and the idea that music has kind of a scientific explanation is not new. Pythagoras, way back in Greece, ancient Greece, was talking about how music was mathematical, right? And we could show how harmonies came to be harmonic. But John Powell wrote a book not too long ago called Why You Love Music, or Why We Love Music. And it kind of spells out some of these elements where the mathematics of the music, as well as um, the physiological reactions to music, can help us explain why music is so effective in creating certain emotional responses. So we can actually craft sad music. Like that's not an arbitrary assignment to any kind of sound. There is music that is crafted to heighten our expectations and maybe break them in a certain way that would cause a disappointment or a sadness, a melancholy. And there's some that can give us a joy, the satisfaction of, yes, they nailed it, right? And so pop music uses those elements, finds the formulas that work to provide a certain kind of experience, and then just kind of do it over and over and over again. And so there is some difference between songs, and you can even see different styles of pop music, but there's a lot of similarity because those formulas work.
Yeah, that's a really great way to phrase it. And I think of internet memes as the same way, right? The most memes take the same picture, and they'll just remove the words from the picture, and they'll tweak it relevant to whatever situation they're talking about. So you have this initial effect of haha it's funny because I've seen this picture before, and also haha it's funny because I didn't think of applying that to this situation. It's more to that. So if you think that, we're in total control of everything we say and do, pop music and memes, and I would say the world of marketing in general, is basically there to tell you, no, you're not in control at all, and we actually influence everything you say and do. You go into a clothing store, and the music tracks are selected just enough so that one, they either are designed to get you to leave as quickly as possible. Think of restaurants and how they influence like temperature and the setting, pack the tables close. It's all made to make you slightly uncomfortable so that you eat and get the hell out so they can bring in a new person. Or, in the clothing store example, the music is designed to get you to stay and browse and feel a little bit more comfortable so that you try things on, and then also put you in a happy mood so that you're like, oh, I like this. I'm going to go buy it. And it's not that simple, but at the same time, it kind of is. Everything I say and do in my personal life, I can't help but think like, am I making this choice?
Right, right. You take the kind of Pavlovian behavioral science and what psychologists learned in that century and combine it with the marketing intention to manipulate us. They very much want to present the circumstances and conditions like putting cereal boxes at certain eye level, to manipulate us to make certain actions and choices. So as much as you think you might have free will, maybe it just is what it is. Hey, so we recorded and released 10 episodes already, and here's our 11th getting ready to come out. And we have some great and exciting news for you. Anthony?
Yeah, so the first 10 episodes are going to be, they're going to appear on your favorite podcasting platform. And from here on out, each episode we're going to upload with the live video version. So you'll be able to listen to us and watch us on YouTube and check us out on all your favorite podcasting platforms.